If we look at this map, and this is official data from the UN dated either March or April, March this year, we can see that all the jurisdictions in dark green are the ones that have data protection legislation around the world. The ones in light green have draft legislation being discussed. The ones in orange have no legislation, and the ones in grey have no available data. So we can see where they're concentrated, the jurisdictions where there's no available data. And even as we try to confirm this information with our local partners and international players with whom we work, it's not always easy to obtain this information even on site as they work with existing authorities or with governments and judicial authorities. So what do we have in Africa when we're talking numbers? We have a total of 54 countries in Africa with very different legal scenarios, legal frameworks, political frameworks, and social issues that have impacts necessarily on data protection issues. Roughly half of them have data protection legislation in some form, and this includes both constitutional commitment towards privacy or a general data protection law, or even sector-specific legislation on data protection. So nearly half of them. 12 countries have no legislation in terms of data protection, and this draft is out of date as of last week because Egypt has just approved its own data protection law. So never mind this slide, it's one more for the angels. And we have 8 countries that have draft legislation being discussed at either government or parliamentary level. So as we can see, that we have roughly half of these countries have some form of legislation and a formal commitment towards data protection and privacy, but there's still quite a lot of them that have absolutely none to talk about. So if we can talk about trends in Africa in terms of the status quo, we have different states of status of maturity, if we may. One, countries that have no legal protection for data privacy, and we're talking either at a maximum constitutional level or even administratively, and we're excluding from this related and associated constitutional principles of the right not to be persecuted or to the freedom of speech. We're talking specific protection of personal data and privacy. Some countries have general protection, which means that they do protect personal data at a national law level. They have a general law on data protection, and this is the majority of the 23 countries we talked about. And when they do have this legislation, it tends to be very much aligned with EU principles pre-GDPR, because most of these laws are prior to the GDPR having been approved. So we're talking, they have basic principles of transparency, of clarity, principles of consent, the obligation to contact the DPA for certain formalities, and the combination of powers between judicial authorities and the DPA that is specifically focused on data protection. That's the general scenario of countries that do have data protection laws in Africa. And then we have a few ones, like, for example, Angola, that does have not only the data protection law, general data protection law, but an e-privacy law. And this is also pretty much aligned with the EU gold standard in terms of data protection.